Psalm 78. We're on Psalm 78. Wow, we were worshiping a few minutes ago, singing about the dry bones, dancing. Just wave your hand. How many of you spoke to your dry bones last week? How many of you have seen some life so far in these dry bones? You've seen some life in dry bones already? Okay, speak to the dry bones. Whatever it is that is dead, whatever it is that's decayed, whatever it is that there's no hope, no help, whatever that situation is in your life, except God. Remember God takes Ezekiel out, because we're gonna kind of pick up from last Sunday. Remember God takes Ezekiel out there in Ezekiel 37 and takes him to the valley of bones, and he saw that there were many, many bones, and lo, they were very dry. They were sun-parched, sun-bleached. And remember the question that God asked. God asked him a simple question: can these bones live? Remember, were y'all here last week? Most of it. Remember what I shared with you in that question that God asked Ezekiel: can these bones live? That's in the Old Testament. It was written in Hebrew, and the Hebrew construction of that question was, the obvious answer is no. Remember we talked about this, and I asked you, have you ever asked your children a question, and you structure the question so as when you ask the question is obviously yes or obviously no. You grab your kid's hand, you take them over the stove. Is this stove hot? Oh. And you structure the question. Well, the way God structured that question was, in the natural, everybody say the natural, now what we see. When he said, can these bones live? The obvious answer was no. In the natural, by what we see. Can these bones live? No. He's in a valley. There's a valley full of bones. It says there were many, which means there were a lot of them. An abundance. Actually, the word is a superabundance. A superabundance of bones. And the scripture says, lo, they were very dry. They were dry because they'd been out in the heat and in the sun. And there was no life. So if you and I had been looking out over that valley of bones that were very dry, and God asked us a question, if he were to ask us a question, and the way he structured that question, the obvious answer is no. Can these bones live? But Ezekiel says, you know if they can live, Lord. Remember? And what we kind of concluded is that Ezekiel had experienced the hand of God beginning back in chapter 1 all the way through up to chapter 37. That Ezekiel ministered in a time frame after Elijah ministered as a prophet, and perhaps maybe, I'm just speculating, maybe the word of the widow from Zarephath's son rising from the dead when Elijah breathed on him. I mean, maybe Ezekiel had a point of reference to go back to and say, well, you know what, if that can happen, then maybe these can happen. God, you know if they can. The point is, Ezekiel didn't say no. The question was structured, the obvious answer was no, and Ezekiel did not say no. Because somewhere in Ezekiel's mind, watch this, Ezekiel began to bring God into the equation. Somewhere in Ezekiel's mind, he began to bring God into the equation. Now, if Ezekiel had left God out of the equation, Ezekiel's answer would have been, no, sir. But somehow in his mind, he began to bring God into the equation. And he said, you know if they can live. And then God says, well, speak to these bones. And he spoke to the bones. And he said, prophesy of the wind. The breath came in. You know the story, right? The dry bones lived. They got up and they walked. And they were alive. The question from God was, can these bones live? I want to ask you another question. Last week the question was from God to us, can these bones live? And now there's another question I want to ask you. Can God? Can God? Ephesians 3:20. You're wondering, can God what? Does it matter? You have the liberty to fill in the blank. Can God? Yes. Heal type 1 diabetes? Yes. Can God change your heart? Yes. Can God? You fill in the blank. Can God? Well, I answer is yes. If you look in Psalm 78, and give me a couple minutes, I want to read you a story of the history of, part of the history of God's people in their exodus from Egypt. And then the people of God asked the question, can God furnish the table in the wilderness? Look in Psalm 78, because you're saying yes, and I want you to remember your yeses, okay? And the scripture says, let your yes be yes. Look in Psalm 78, verse 1. This is Asaph who's written this song. Give ear, O my people, to my law. Incline your ears to the words of my mouth. I will open my mouth in a parable. I will utter dark sayings of old, which we have heard and known, and our fathers have told us. We will not hide them from our children. Whose responsibility is it to tell their children about the things of God? Showing to the generation to come the praises of the Lord and His strength and His wonderful works that He has done. For He established a testimony in Jacob and appointed a law in Israel, which He commanded our fathers that they should make them known to their children, that the generation to come might know them, even the children which should be born, who should arise and declare them to their children, that they might set their hope in God, and not forget the works of God, but keep His commandments, and might not be as their fathers, a stubborn and rebellious generation, a generation that set not their heart aright, and whose spirit was not steadfast with God. The children of Ephraim, being armed and carrying bows, turned back in the day of battle. They kept not the covenant of God, and returned to walk in His, and refused to walk in His law, and forgot His works and His wonders that He had shown them. Marvelous things did He in the sight of their fathers, in the land of Egypt, in the field of Zoan. He divided the sea and caused them to pass through. And He made the waters to stand as an heap. He's recounting the history now. In the daytime also He led them with a cloud, and all the night with a light of fire. He clave the rocks in the wilderness, and gave them drink as one out of the great depths. He brought streams also out of the rock. And can y'all imagine? And caused waters to run down like rivers. And they sinned yet more against Him by provoking the Most High in the wilderness. And they tempted God in their heart by asking meat for their lust. Yes, they spoke against God. They said, can God? After all they had seen, after all the miracles that God had done, they asked. They actually spoke against God, the Scripture says, and said, can God furnish a table in the wilderness? Behold, He smote the rock, that the waters gushed out, and the streams overflowed. Can He give bread also? Can He provide flesh for His people? Therefore the Lord heard this, and was wroth, very angry. So a fire was kindled against Jacob, and His anger also came up against Israel, because they believed not in God, and trusted not in His deliverance. After all they saw, after all they witnessed, after all they experienced,